Good morning and welcome to the NSCAS General Summative Scheduling Guidance Meeting. Today we want to share with you information that will help you schedule sessions for the 2019 NSCAS General Summative Tests. Last year we collected a lot of different information and data, and that is really key to help us make the recommendations that we're going to make today and to help you while you're scheduling the sessions for the spring. In this PowerPoint and presentation, we're going to go over the scheduling recommendation and guidance. We'll cover the supporting data and what that shows us and how that supports the recommendations we're making. Then we'll talk about the resources, and finally we'll go over and answer any questions that you might have. First of all, scheduling priorities. It's really important to establish what we here at NDE feel is the most important, and first of all, that is that student need and not adult convenience should rule the day. So when it comes to making decisions, it shouldn't be about scheduling what's convenient for us. It should be about what students need. Ultimately, students should have the time they need to demonstrate their knowledge and skill, but we also must be aware of and try to balance this need for students to demonstrate their knowledge and skill with the importance of instructional time. What we know is that there were a lot of students that took a very long amount of time last year on the NSCAS, ELA, and math, and we really want to see if we can't minimize the number of students that are doing that. But we also want students to be able to show us what they know and have the time that they need. So it is all about trying to find a balance between those two pieces. The first thing I'd like to go over is educator involvement. It's important to know that educators, proctors can inform students ahead of time about expectations, and that doing so might help students understand what is expected of them during testing and what the typical student would typically do, right? So prior to testing, students can be informed about those expectations. You could say something like, we want you to do your best, but if you cannot figure out the answer, you should use your best test-taking strategies and make an educated guess. You could also say something like, last year, most students finished in less than 90 minutes. You could also say the test is on time, but the majority of students will not need more than 90 minutes. So you can set up those expectations ahead of time so that students know how much time they are likely to need and how much time they are likely to take. That being said, of course, if they need more time, we want to give that to them, especially if they have a documented needs such as an IEP or an EL plan. Educators should also be careful about encouraging students to take as much time as they need. We do say that students can have as much time as they need, but when we overemphasize that fact, we can have detrimental effects to how long students are engaged with these tests. First of all, know that longer times do not always result in higher scores. Students can spend a lot of time on these tests and not necessarily do better than they would have if they had spent significantly less time. Actively engaged students, on the other hand, will typically do better than students that are trying to take longer to please an adult. Last year, we had a classroom of about 35, 40 students, and all of them took at least 90 minutes on the English language arts test. What I can tell you from that is, based on our averages, that most of those students probably could have been done ahead of 90 minutes. Or at least a portion of them could have been done ahead of 90 minutes, but it's likely that the teacher may have said something like, I expect you to take 90 minutes, or you better not be done before you take 90 minutes. All of those things are off script and wouldn't be allowed, and so it's important to know that actively engaged students are more important than simply the time that they're sitting in front of the computer. Educators should be mindful of the students that are not progressing through the assessment. If a student is stuck on an item due to over-analysis or an inability to find the right answer and wasting time to avoid returning to class, we should take care of that. We should be monitoring the situation. If we see that type of thing, we can intervene as proctors, and I'll give you some guidance on that as we go forward. Educators, this is very important though, educators may not pay students. They cannot dictate the speed at which they engage with items. It is not allowable to say a student needs to speed up or needs to slow down and expect them to follow that. That being said, we can redirect students. So if a student is not focused in, is not engaged, it's okay to say, please refocus on the test and make sure you do your best. So if a student is spacing off out the window and not engaged in the test, it's perfectly fine to say that. It's also perfectly fine if you notice a student that is clicking through the test rather quickly. It is also okay to say, slow down and make sure you are showing us what you know and what you can do. Those are types of engagement that proctors are allowed. Scheduling recommendations. So here is the meat of the recommendations that we're making. So for NSCAS mathematics, we're recommending scheduling 90 minutes, but you need to plan for students that will need longer. It is likely that there will be some students that need longer. And we are recommending that you divide that into 2 or 3 sessions. For NSCAS ELA, we're recommending 120 minutes scheduled time, and plan for students that will also need longer, divided into 2 or 3 sessions. And finally, for NSCAS Science, we're recommending 45 minutes of scheduled time, and that can be done in a single session for most students. Most students are able to do that and very easily in that amount of time. And we'll show you some data to back all of these recommendations up so that you know why we are recommending what we are recommending. The other thing that we want everybody to realize is districts can examine their own testing time data from 2018. In your district data file, there is data that is available about elapsed time for all the tests. We encourage districts to take a look at that and help that inform, along with our recommendations, what you do for scheduling. That also can be looked at to see if there were classrooms or even students that were taking abnormally long or abnormally short amount of time on testing. So we encourage you to take a look at that. Here's some information about ELA, and just as for an example, there's a lot of other information we have as well. As you'll see, we have the grades down the side, we'll have the number of students this represents, and then the mean time. So this is time in minutes. So the average student in 3rd grade took 84.57 minutes to complete the ELA test. That varied from a low of 77.49 here up to 90.37 for 5th grade. So there is some variation between classes, but for the most part, they're right in this relatively pretty tight range. Here's the standard deviation and the median as well. We also have the minimum and max, and so you can see there's some students that took extremely short amount of time. That's not okay. This student here took 1.8 minutes to take the test. That is extremely fast, considering that a student would have to answer every single question as a part of that to be able to submit it in that amount of time. Even the fact that the computer pulled up questions that fast is pretty impressive that they could get through it that fast. Impressive, but not what we want, right? And so we want to make sure we're thinking about that. On the other end of this, this student up here took 544 minutes. That is 9 hours and 4 minutes of active test time. It's really important that if a student needs time that they have it, but I think almost all of us could agree that 9 hours and 4 minutes of testing time is too much. What we do know about that student is that they have an IEP and they're an EL student, but what we also know is that Proctor paused every 2 questions for that student. Now, I don't know if that was necessary or not. I don't know the student. I don't work with that student every day, but it makes me wonder if it was necessary and if it was helpful for that student. In general, that student probably needed more instructional time instead of more testing time. And so want to be thoughtful about that as we move forward. And continue on with their recommendations. Like I said, districts should take examine their own testing data from 2018. That's in hour, minutes, and seconds. It's column AB in your district data file. We'd also encourage educators to talk with students prior to testing. If you know you have a student that took 1.8 minutes last year on the test, before that testing time, we'd encourage a teacher, an educator, it could be the music teacher or a coach that has a conversation with that student and encourages them to make their best effort. On the other side, if you know you have a student that took an extremely long amount of time, it would probably benefit you to have a conversation about test taking skills and making sure that students use their test taking strategies to eliminate answers and make the best choices they have, and not dwell on questions. The adaptive test can make it so students are really worried about answering that question because they can't come back. It's a function of the test, and it has to stay that way. So making sure that they understand that and help them to move on ahead of time might be a good way to try to get the times back into a more realistic and reasonable amount of time. So talking to students that you know have a proclivity to be short test takers or long test takers might help in even all that information out. A vast majority of students will finish ELA and mathematics in 2 hours of less. Typically, students need more time, will either have a documented need, an IEP or an EL plan, IEP or EL plan, or have a history of lengthy test taking. Districts may stop students at 3 hours unless, one, educators feel there's an educationally valid reason to continue, and one of the following is true: that the student is still actively engaged in testing, the student has a documented need for extended time, or the student requests additional time. Now, that doesn't mean you have to give those things if you don't think they're educationally valid reasons to do so. Also note that a student only has to participate in 10 questions before they would get 10 operational questions before they would get a score. So stopping a student at 3 hours doesn't mean that the student get a 0 score, or even any answers that they don't make are going to be counted against them. It does mean that maybe those results aren't going to be as reliable as they would have been if they had finished the whole test, but know that students will get a score as long as they answer those minimum number of questions. We think that this should happen very rarely, but it can happen, and we encourage you to consider these options very carefully. Educators should also avoid practices that unduly prolong the test. So frequent unneeded breaks that prevent students from finding a rhythm or cause a student to reread passages in ELA. So one of the biggest things that I think about on the ELA test, being a former ELA teacher, is that a student is engaged in a passage in a series of questions. If we interrupt them in the middle of that, then it might be necessary for the students to reread that passage when they come back. And so thinking about that and trying to prevent that, we will continue to allow for you to warn students, give students a warning when the test session is about to end and the scheduled time is about to end, so that students can stop before going on to another passage. But in general, doing anything that breaks the rhythm or causes disruption in the room should be prevented if at all possible. Putting undue emphasis on a test that causes student anxiety and the inability to move forward in the test. So we understand these tests are important. We believe they are important to give us good information, but they are not the most important thing in the world. And for students, we need to have the right amount of emphasis on these tests, not too much, not too little, and things that if you know you have a student that has high anxiety about these things, making sure that we encourage them to give us their best, but not overemphasizing the test is important too. Like I said before, pacing a student's progress is not allowed. Proctors should not interfere unless it is clear that the student is, one, either clicking through without effort, so you're welcome to engage the student at that point and ask them to slow down and give us their best effort, or if a student is stuck and not able to move forward, you're able to offer encouragement and ask students to refocus, engage, and keep moving through the test. Educators may encourage engagement, but may not require or punish a student in any way if they don't do those things. So breaks. Last year we had some confusing language about breaks. In the past we didn't allow breaks. The adaptive nature of these tests allow us to break these tests wherever we would like, and to schedule different sessions. So here's some new guidance around breaks. So due to the adaptive nature, group breaks are no longer prohibitive. That being said, if schedules are devised wisely, most students will not need a break in the middle of a session, right? So if you don't schedule a really long session on a single day, they shouldn't need a break. If you have smaller sessions, it should take care of itself. So in general, breaks should be used sparingly and only for long scheduled sessions, which are not, of course, recommended. We should avoid interfering in the test atmosphere, so encouraging students to stand up and stretch or do things that disrupt other students could have a poor effect on students, right? So if a student is in the middle of the passage and a teacher calls for a break, that would be disruptive to that student and not probably beneficial to how they will actually perform on the test. And it should be part of the established schedule. So if you have a break, make sure everybody knows when that break's going to happen. Make sure you've scheduled it ahead of time and that it's clear when that's going to happen. And that would help students as far as how to engage with certain items on the test. So now we're going to go into the data. I think here is a description of variables. Most people will know these variables. I'll talk about two of them very quickly. Test duration, all of this data is in minutes of students actively involved, right? So it's actually, they're logged into the test, and so the timer's going. When a test is paused, when they get out of the test, it doesn't count that time. Also, active number of days down at the bottom. So this only counts days in which students have logged into the test. If they are gone for a day and they don't log in, it doesn't count them in this information. So those are probably the two that we might need clarification on. So first of all, here's the average test duration. So down the left side, you see grades 3 through 8. And then you have ELA, math, and science. You can see the average times for all of those. You can see ELA is closer to 90 minutes. The math varies from 60 up to 77 minutes, and the science there is 38 minutes for the average student to get done. So there's that information. Go on to ELA. So on the left side, once again, you have the percentage of students that have completed the test. And across the bottom, you have less than 60 minutes, 60 minutes to 120 minutes, 120 minutes to 180 minutes. So and on up all the way to over 360 minutes. Each of the grades is there for you, so you can see the pattern. So as you can see, the majority of the students finish between 60 minutes and 120 minutes. We know the average for these grades were on the ELA were between 76 and 90 minutes. We also know that 83 to 91% of the students are done within 120 minutes, some significantly less than that, but all that is a pretty high percentage. We also know that almost all students are finished within 180 minutes. There are some students that go all the way out, and we really want to make sure those students actually need that time and benefit from that time. So we want to think about those students as we move forward as well. Here's the math information. It looks similar, but there are some differences. As you can see, once again, the percentage of students down the left side, across the bottom, the minutes again. The average time for math was between 61 and 77 minutes. Between 92 and 99% of students are done within 120 minutes, so that's a higher rate than the ELA, and that's reflective of the recommendations and scheduling that we made. 99% of students are done within 180 minutes. You can see that there are some slight differences there about if you take a look at third grade, for instance, 60% of students were done under 60 minutes, and then that number is lower between 60 and 120 minutes. Most of them go up when that happens, but there is definitely variation within grades here. And here is science. Science, of course, looks quite a bit different to this, and which is reflected in the recommendations that we made. The average number of minutes is between 37 and 38 minutes by grade for students. So 90%, 92% of students are done within 90 minutes. Actually, within 60 minutes, actually, and 99% of students are done within 120 minutes. So the science does not take students very long. The current science does not take very long. That's likely to change as we change to college and career ready science assessments in 2021. So just some additional information from this. For ELA, so students with IEPs have similar times, average times, as with students without IEPs. EL students, on the other hand, took longer to finish the assessment than students without that are not EL, which makes sense considering this test is not translated, it's all in English. And so we would probably expect those students to take a little bit longer. The number of passages, typically the greater the number of passages, the longer that it takes for a student to finish the test. However, students in 7th and 8th grade, whether they have 7 passages or less than 7 passages, is about the same regardless. We have additional information about the number of passages available to you in some of our other guidance. Know that that's not consistent because of the adaptability of the test. And so some students may get less passages than other students. They all get the same number of questions, but they might get a different number of passages. Subgroup information, again, with math, very similar. So students with IEPs typically have similar average times as students without IEPs. There is some variation that you can see there. And EL students typically take longer, once again. And then science, both students with IEPs and EL students took longer to finish the assessment than students that did not have those characteristics. So you can kind of plan on that as you're thinking about scheduling, about which students may take longer than other students. So this is test session information. One thing that I'd like to mention before we dive into this a little bit is this was not a research study. So there was no experimental design in this, and therefore these are not matched group sets of students. So we don't have a similar set of students that tested on 1 day versus tested on 2 days versus testing on 3 days. So there may be characteristics about the districts and the students that finished on those days and only had 1 day, 2 days, or 3 days that might contribute to the patterns that we're seeing. That being said, we still wanted to present this to you so that you can see the reason why we're making recommendations that we are. So this is ELA. Scale score is up on the vertical axis, and across the bottom is the number of active days testing. As you can see, all grades went up from day 1 to day 2. So the average scale score, if a student had 2 days, is higher than if they had 1 day. And then you see some variations in the lower grades, in grades 3, 4, and 5. 3 days, students that had 3 days tended to go back down somewhat, right? So they might have still performed better with 3 days than 1 day, but they might not have performed as well as those students that had only 2 days. Grades 6, 7, and 8, on the other hand, students that took 3 days to take the assessment had even higher scores on average. Once again, we don't know the reason why, but that's why we're encouraging districts to move away from 1 day and divide it into 2 or 3 days. I have some ideas about that. It might be because for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade students that are in a middle school model, they might have not broken their schedule at all and just stuck with the regular schedule, used that over the course of 3 days, and therefore those students might have been done better because it didn't break up the normal day and disrupt things. That being said, we don't know the exact reason, but this is the information we have, and we encourage you to look at your own data as well to see if you can determine things, scheduling information that might be beneficial to your particular students. Also know that we'll continue to monitor this from year to year and continuing to update guidance as we move forward. So here's the math. It's varied to some extent. In general, students that took 2 days had higher average scores than those that took 1 day. And then it's a mixed bag based on grades. Some grades did a little bit better if they had 3 days. Some grades did not. Once again, we don't know why, but these are not matched sets of students. And so the student characteristics themselves might have contributed to that variation. So in general, we're recommending away from 1 day, encouraging 2 or 3 days, whatever makes sense to you on that as you're making your scheduling plans. Science is a much different look here. So as you can see, students that took 1 day did averaged a much better scale score than those that took 2 days, and even better than those that took 3 days. So in general, we're recommending for most students that they complete that in 1 day. The size of the test and how fast students can navigate through that test indicates that 1 day should be fine for the vast majority of students. So additional resources. So the first 3 here are going to be available here in the next week. So the PowerPoint that I'm going through today and the recording of this session. We're also going to provide NSCAS general scheduling guidance. It's a 2-page document that we released last year, and it has updated information in it. And then we also have a supplemental guide here as well that has supporting data for this. And so I'm going to show those 2 documents to you here in a minute, and show you the additional information that you will have available to you as you're making scheduling decisions. The last 2 things are not going to be available right away, but as soon as they're ready, we'll put that out for you. So the NSCAS general manuals will include scripts for subsequent sessions. So any day after the first day, it'll have a shorter script for proctors to use, so it doesn't take so long to get into the tests. And we're also going to offer this year suggested language for testing scenarios. We know that teachers are often worried about doing or saying the wrong thing, and so we're going to provide some sample language that teachers could use in certain situations that might allow them to encourage students but not interfere in a test that would be in a way that would be prohibited by NDE. And so those are things that will be coming out soon. Let's go ahead and look at those other documents. So first of all, so this is the supporting data. It includes some of the data that we went through in the PowerPoint. But as you can see, there's a whole series of descriptive statistics here for all 3 subject areas. It gives general information about how many students tested within each time band. Also here is information about the number of days a student actively tested and the mean scale score. So you can say, okay, so students that took 1 day, what was their mean scale score? Students that took 2 days. We put all that together for you so that you can see it very easily. ELA, the same information for math, and the same information for science is listed there. Another graph that table that we provided here is looking at students that did, these were all students that completed in 1 day, but we divided it into students that had no pause, so they sat straight through, and students that had at least 1 or more pauses. And so you can see the average scale score for those that had 1 pause versus those that had 2 pauses. In most cases, some sort of pause or break was beneficial, but not in all cases. And so kind of take a look at that as you're continuing to think about your scheduling that you're going to be working on for this in the spring. Here is a histogram, a series of histograms for ELA, math, and for science that shows you how students did based on time. So you can see the number of minutes and where the majority of students were typically done. That should give you some good information there. Same for math and for science. And the last set of graphs here are scatter plots that have scale score and the duration of the test. So you can see what the relationship is with spending time, short time or a long amount of time on the test, and how students did on that. So as you can see, as you look through those, just because you spent more time on the test doesn't mean you automatically got a higher score. And so there's good information here that might help you as you're making decisions about scheduling. So that's one document. The other document is the scheduling guidance that has basically all the information that we really went over today, including a bunch of bullets on key points that we want to make. This is a quick 2-page document for you that you can look over, you can share with others. If you need additional information, you can use that other document that I just shared with you, or you could use the PowerPoint in this recording. So you have a lot of different resources available to you as you're making decisions and helping people in your district make the best schedules possible for your students. Couple last pieces here. In conclusion, while these tests and the results are important, it's critical that we balance the need for students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills with the time they could be in the classroom continuing to learn, right? And so it's really important to us that students can do their best, have the time to do their best, but are not spending time that's not beneficial to them, taking the test longer than necessary. So Indy encourages districts to give students all the time that they need on NSCAS, but no more than they need. At some point, a student spending more time on a test will not give us any better information. Okay, well, that's all we have for today. I want to thank everybody that participated, and if you have any additional questions, please let us know. Send an email or a call to NDE at the assessment office, and we'd be happy to help you with anything we can. So thank you for your time, and everybody have a good day.